Hey guys, have you ever stepped outside on a winter night, felt that knife of cold air sting your lungs and thought to yourself, thank goodness for heating. Now imagine living in a world where that luxury didn't exist. No radiators, no furnaces, no space heaters humming in the corner. Just stone, wood, and whatever tricks you could come up with to outwit the season. That was daily life for people in the Middle Ages, and later in the Victorian era. Two very different worlds, yes, but united by one brutal fact. Winter was the enemy and survival was a nightly battle. The popular image we carry of castles is almost cinematic. Blazing fireplaces, fur-draped beds, and nobles toasting goblets of wine in warm candlelight. But here's the harsh truth. Those roaring fires, they heated only a tiny bubble of space. Move 10 feet away and your breath misted in the air again. And if you've ever been inside an old stone basement in January, you know the feeling. The walls didn't keep warmth in, they stored the cold like a memory. So how did people survive? They layered, they improvised, and they endured. Imagine walking from the castle's great hall, where a massive fire painted the walls with golden light, into a narrow, torch-lit passage. Within seconds, the warmth drained from your bones. It felt almost supernatural, like the castle itself fed on your heat. That journey from fire to bed wasn't just physical, it was psychological. You carried the dread with you, knowing that the night would be long, and that warmth was always temporary. Victorians faced the same dilemma centuries later, but instead of stone castles, their battleground was drafty townhouses and sooty industrial cities. Coal stoves replaced open hearths, but those iron boxes were greedy, devouring endless fuel while barely heating more than a single parlor. Whole families huddled in one room, shutting doors tight, because the rest of the house might as well have been an icebox. Think about that the next time you walk through your heated hallway in bare feet. But let's step back into the medieval castle for a moment. If you picture a noble family's chamber, you might imagine luxury. Feather beds, fur covers, heavy curtains. And yes, those things existed, but here's the twist. Comfort came at a price. Blankets piled so high that people joked you couldn't roll over without risking frostbite. Beds enclosed with curtains to trap body heat, but so tight that the air inside turned stale, sometimes even smoky from the fireplace. And if you woke to find frost glittering on the inside of the canopy, that wasn't a dream. It was your own breath crystallized in the night. Peasants, meanwhile, might have had the better deal. Their cottages were cramped, yes, but small enough that a single hearth could warm the entire room. Families often slept together, pressed shoulder to shoulder, sometimes with animals tucked inside the same space. Not glamorous, but warmer. It's one of those historical ironies. A poor farmer's hut could be cozier than a lord's tower. And here's where it gets fascinating. Both in medieval times and in the Victorian age, survival wasn't about grand inventions. It was about small, clever rituals. In castles, servants laid down fresh rushes, grasses and herbs spread across the floors to insulate against icy stone. For a few days, they smelled almost pleasant, earthy and green like summer sneaking indoors. But soon enough they soured, fouled with scraps, spills, and mice. By midwinter, one moralist described them as filth fit only for a midden heap. Yet families kept spreading them because even foul-smelling rushes trapped a fraction of warmth. Victorians had their own version. They lined floors with thick carpets, hung heavy draperies over windows, and stuffed rags into cracks around the frames. In wealthy homes, servants carried hot water bottles, sometimes copper or ceramic, up to bed. In poorer districts, families heated bricks by the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and slid them under the covers. The idea was the same. Fight the first shock of cold so the body could relax into sleep. And if you've ever slipped your feet into a bed that feels like ice, you know exactly why that mattered. But the fight wasn't just physical. It was mental, even spiritual. Medieval people whispered prayers and hung sprigs of herbs above their beds, juniper, rosemary, mugwort, believing they kept out both frost and spirits. Victorians, steeped in their own blend of science and superstition, turned to patent medicines and folk remedies. Take a dram of hot gin before bed, some advised, to warm the blood. Others swore by garlic or by rubbing goose fat on the chest before sleep. Strange, maybe. But when the night pressed in, people reached for whatever gave them hope. Imagine lying in a castle chamber. The fire has died to embers. Smoke lingers in the curtains and frost creeps across the shutters. You're buried under wool, linen, and fur, so heavy you can hardly move. At your feet, a hound shifts in its sleep, its body heat seeping into your toes. Outside, the wind howls against the battlements. Inside, you whisper a prayer, clutch a rosary, or maybe just mutter a curse against the cold. Now fast forward 5 centuries. A Victorian child curls in bed beside siblings, a hot brick wrapped in cloth pressed to her toes. The smell of coal dust fills the air, mixed with cabbage soup from supper. She tugs the blanket tighter, listening to the muffled rumble of carriages outside. Different world, same battle. That's the rhythm we'll explore together in this story. Not just how people slept, but how they survived. How families engineered little pockets of warmth, whether through architecture, fabric, food, or faith, in a world where winter wasn't a season to enjoy, but a test to endure. And maybe the real question we'll ask along the way is this: what kept people alive wasn't stone walls or coal stoves. It was resilience, ingenuity, and community. Because against the endless cold of history, humanity itself became the true fire. Picture this. You step into a grand medieval chamber, expecting warmth because there's a fire roaring in the hearth. But the reality, step just a few feet away from the flames and the air cuts into you like a knife. Stone walls don't trap heat, they swallow it. They breathe cold right back at you, the way an old cellar seems to cling to dampness no matter the season. That's the cruel irony of medieval architecture. Castles were designed to keep enemies out, not warmth in. And so the bed became more than just furniture. It was a fortress within the fortress. Heavy oak frames rose tall, crowned with carved posts, and thick curtains draped down to seal in whatever scraps of heat a body could make. Imagine sliding into one of these canopy beds. You draw the curtains, and instantly the world shrinks. Outside the fabric is a cavern of cold, but inside you've built yourself a tiny climate. A fragile bubble of survival. Did it really work? That's still debated. Some scholars argue those curtains added only a psychological sense of warmth, like a child pulling a blanket over their head and pretending the monsters can't get in. Others point to archaeological evidence showing thick layers of cloth, sometimes even waxed, suggesting the insulation was real. But maybe that's the point. When you're fighting the kind of cold that leaves frost on your pillow, psychology matters as much as physics. If you believed you were safer, you probably rested easier. Now compare this to the Victorian world. By the 1800, beds were still draped in curtains, but less for warmth, more for privacy in crowded homes. The real change came with coal. Iron stoves began appearing in parlors and bedrooms, replacing the vast, wasteful fireplaces of castles. At first, they seemed miraculous. A little box, glowing red, capable of heating a room. But coal carried its own curses. Soot blackened every surface, ash filled the lungs, and fuel costs gnawed at household budgets. In poor London neighborhoods, families burned whatever they could find: peat, scraps of wood, even trash, just to keep frost off their windows. Yet whether you were a medieval knight or a Victorian seamstress, the bedtime ritual was strikingly similar. You layered. Wool over linen, fur over wool, cloak over fur. People swaddled themselves like cocoons because stillness meant survival. Too many blankets, you couldn't roll over. Too few. You risked waking stiff with frost. Servants joked about nobles pinned under heaps of covers, unable to move until morning. And if you've ever woken trapped under a heavy comforter, you know the feeling. Except for them, the alternative wasn't a chilly inconvenience. It was danger. Peasants solved it differently. In a thatched cottage, space was tight, but the hearth was central. Families, and often animals, slept together, body heat mingling into one communal furnace. A peasant child might drift off with a lamb tucked against their legs, or with the steady breath of siblings pressed close. The smell of wool, smoke, and animals filled the air, but comfort trumped fragrance. One medieval saying even hinted at it: better a flea in the blanket than frost on the toes. And here's something fascinating. Both medieval and Victorian households embraced little inventions that feel oddly familiar today. Nobles used bed warmers. Brass pans filled with hot coals slid between the sheets to take off the chill. Victorians perfected the hot water bottle, sometimes porcelain, sometimes rubber, hugging it close through the night. In poorer homes, it might be a brick from the fire wrapped in cloth. All these tools carried risk: burns, fires, accidents, but the trade-off was worth it. Because no one wanted to crawl into sheets that felt like ice. Think about it. Every night was a negotiation. You weren't just going to bed. You were engineering survival. From the straw under your mattress to the herbs sprinkled in your rushes. From the coal fire in a Victorian stove to the faithful dog curled at your feet. It was all strategy. Layer by layer, habit by habit, people fought the same invisible war, keeping warmth close and cold at bay. And maybe that's the most human part of this story. Because whether it was a medieval monk whispering a psalm before pulling his wool blanket tighter, or a Victorian mother tucking her children in with a steaming mug of milk, the goal was always the same: make it through the night. So let's step deeper into that nightly world. Imagine you're walking from the great hall of a medieval castle after an evening of food and firelight. You climb the stairs, and with every step the warmth fades. By the time you reach your chamber, the air feels like a damp cave. Stone walls sweat with condensation, and your breath fogs in front of you. You draw your cloak tighter, already dreading the moment you have to slip beneath the blankets. Inside, the smell hits first. Forget the lavender-scented candles and crisp laundry ads we know today. A medieval or even early Victorian bedroom carried its own cocktail of scents. Smoke from the hearth, damp wool that never quite dried, the grassy musk of straw mattresses, and, if you were lucky, a faint whiff of rosemary or mint scattered on the floor to keep the stench down. People weren't oblivious to these odors. They tried to mask them, burning incense if they were wealthy, or hanging bundles of herbs from rafters if they were not. But no matter what, the air was thick with survival. And here's where food and drink played their part. Supper wasn't just about filling the belly, it was fuel for the night ahead. A steaming pottage of peas and barley clung heavy in the stomach, radiating warmth outward, almost like an inner blanket. In noble homes, this might be enriched with meat or cream, while in cottages, families ladled simple broth by the fire. Victorians had their own rituals, cups of hot cocoa, mulled wine, or milk warmed with honey. These weren't just treats, they were strategies. If the body was fed with heat, the mind could endure the long dark. Children and elders, though, were the ones everyone worried about most. Strong men could grit their teeth through a cold night, but a baby, an old grandmother, their bodies simply didn't produce enough heat to withstand the chill. Families took no chances. Infants were swaddled like tiny mummies in layers of wool and linen, often placed near the fire or directly in the parents' bed. Old folks claimed the warmest spots, right by the hearth or under the heaviest furs. In one account from Burgundy, an elderly woman refused to leave the bakehouse because the oven's leftover heat was the only thing that let her sleep. She joked it gave her a second youth, but everyone knew it was no joke at all. Even with all these precautions, people feared the cold like an enemy. Physicians of the Middle Ages talked about it in the language of medicine. They believed frigid air upset the body's balance of humors, clogging blood and phlegm, creating sickness. Their advice sounds strange now. Rub your feet with warm oil before bed, sip spiced wine to keep the humors flowing, even tuck garlic under the covers to ward off frostbite. But think about it. Don't we still do similar things today? Hot tea before sleep, a heating pad on sore joints, it's not so far removed. And then there were the superstitions, because the cold wasn't just a physical threat, it was a spiritual one. People believed icy drafts carried demons, or that the night hag could suffocate sleepers. So iron scissors might be placed under the pillow or sprigs of juniper tied above the bed. Prayers were whispered not only for souls but for warmth. In that moment before the candle was snuffed, faith was another blanket. Can you picture it? The fire dwindling to embers, curtains drawn around the bed, dogs curled at your feet, the smell of garlic, rosemary, and smoke lingering in the air, a grandmother muttering prayers while children giggle themselves to sleep. It wasn't comfort as we define it today. It was survival stitched together from food, fabric, superstition, and sheer stubbornness. And the irony, sometimes peasants crammed into small huts with animals had it easier than nobles in vast stone chambers. The castle might impress visitors, but the cottage held warmth in its crowded simplicity. Grandeur didn't always mean comfort. Sometimes the humblest fire was the truest luxury. Let's step even deeper into the night. Imagine lying there in a chamber that feels less like a bedroom and more like an icebox. You've wrapped yourself in wool, maybe even fur, and still the cold leaks through. Sleep wasn't a single, peaceful stretch the way we expect it today. Back then, rest came in pieces, what historians call segmented sleep. The pattern went something like this. After supper and a few hours by the fire, families drifted into what they called the first sleep. It lasted until midnight or so. Then people woke, not always because they wanted to, but because the fire had to be tended, the animals had to be checked, or simply because the cold pushed them out of their dreams. The house stirred. Someone rose to throw a log on the embers. Parents checked on children, monks shuffled to prayer, lovers whispered quietly in the dark. This midnight interlude was a world of its own, half waking, half dreaming. And then, after an hour or two, people curled back under their covers for the second sleep until dawn. Sounds strange, maybe, But think about how often you've woken in the middle of the night and thought something was wrong with you. To medieval minds, it was natural. The night wasn't a single block of unconsciousness. It was a rhythm, broken by fire, prayer, or conversation. In fact, some early physicians even recommended this break as healthy, a time for reflection, intimacy, or tending the body. Of course, not everyone found it peaceful. Imagine being the servant tasked with stoking the hearth. You stumble barefoot across a stone floor so cold it feels like knives against your soles. The rushes on the floor crunch underfoot, still damp from the day before. You crouch by the fire, blowing gently on embers until sparks flare and smoke stings your eyes. Relief comes as the logs catch, but the effort has woken you fully. You crawl back beneath the blankets, shivering until warmth returns. Only then can you slide back into the second sleep, hoping the fire holds until dawn. And it wasn't just the fire that broke the night. Cold made people resourceful in ways we barely consider today. In cottages, someone might keep a heated stone wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed, passing it from one family member to another as it cooled. In castles, servants rotated duties to guard flames because if the fire went out, the morning would begin with misery. Even monks who vowed lives of discipline kept candles burning in dormitories, not only for light but because the glow itself gave comfort, psychological warmth if not physical. Now picture the soundscape of these interrupted nights. Snores rise and fall from companions crammed side by side. Dogs shift and sigh at your feet. Somewhere in the dark, a child cries, soothed by a mother's whisper. Outside, the wind moans through shutters. And then the crackle of fire as a new log catches. For a moment, you feel safe again. You close your eyes, surrendering to the second stretch of sleep, grateful that someone, maybe you, maybe another, was awake to keep the night at bay. It's tempting to think of this as hardship, but it also created community. Nobody faced the night alone. Whether you were a peasant family huddled together in a single bed, a monk in a long dormitory row, or even a noble with servants nearby, the rhythm of wake and sleep connected you. Each night was a shared negotiation, a pact between bodies, fire, and faith. And if you're wondering, did people complain about this? Absolutely. Letters and diaries mention the frustration of coughing neighbors, barking dogs, or smoke drifting into the bed curtains. But they also mention midnight talks, quiet prayers, even moments of tenderness that daylight never allowed. The night, in its broken rhythm, gave space for both hardship and intimacy. So the next time you wake at 2 a.m. and stare at the ceiling, remember, you're not broken. You're living a rhythm older than modern clocks, a rhythm medieval people accepted as part of survival. Let's keep going. If you've ever crawled under the blankets on a cold night and been grateful for the warmth of another person beside you, then you already understand one of the oldest survival strategies: sharing heat. In the Middle Ages, the bed wasn't just a private piece of furniture. It was a battlefield against cold, and sometimes the only weapon you had was another body. Families piled in together. Parents, children, even grandparents curled shoulder to shoulder, wrapped under one heavy blanket. Privacy, forget it. Warmth mattered more than modesty. In castles, it wasn't much different. Nobles might have had enormous beds with carved posts and curtains, but those beds were rarely for one person alone. Servants sometimes slept on pallets at the foot of the bed, not just for duty, but for warmth. Trusted companions or even favored animals were welcomed beneath the covers. That might sound strange to us, but picture it. A hound pressed against your feet, a squire snoring softly nearby, everyone's body heat pooling in the fabric cocoon. And travelers. Their nights were even more communal. Imagine stopping at an inn on a freezing road in England or France. The host hands you a mug of ale, shows you a crowded chamber, and points to a straw mattress where 3 strangers are already tucked in. You climb in beside them, boots still half on, the smell of smoke, sweat, and stew heavy in the air. It wasn't cozy by modern standards, but compared to freezing alone, it was paradise. Sometimes, inns were so packed that guests ended up in stables instead. At first glance, that sounds degrading, but think about it. Horses and cattle throw off a surprising amount of heat. More than one pilgrim actually preferred curling up in the hay beside animals rather than shivering in an unheated upstairs chamber. You can almost feel it now. The warm breath of a horse in the dark, the rustle of straw, the steady body heat of beasts standing nearby. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept you alive. Even dogs were part of the equation. In fact, there's an old saying about a 3-dog night. It meant the cold was so bitter that one dog at your feet wasn't enough. You needed 3. Medieval people lived that reality. Lapdogs for noble women, mastiffs for hunters and guards, all found their way into beds as heaters with fur. Sure, they shed, carried fleas, and sometimes dragged in dirt, but nobody complained when toes stayed warm. Now let's pause and imagine the contrast. A nobleman in his towering chamber, lying stiffly beneath layers of fur and blankets, the room so vast that his breath still fogs in the air. And a peasant family in a small timber hut, crammed together with children and chickens, their single hearth keeping the whole space warm. Who really slept better? Sometimes the humblest hut was cozier than the grandest hall. The sensory details are unforgettable. The sound of a dozen bodies shifting on a straw mattress. The wet dog smell mixing with smoke and wool. The muffled laughter of children before they finally drifted off. The steady warmth building as bodies pressed together. In those moments, survival wasn't solitary. It was communal. Every extra body was a blessing. So next time you tuck into bed and maybe grumble about sharing the covers, remember, our ancestors survived some of the harshest winters not with central heating, but with each other. Warmth was a gift and it was shared. Let's pick up right where we left off. You've got your bed, your blankets, maybe even a dog or 2 keeping your toes from turning blue. But in the medieval world, that wasn't enough. You needed one more weapon in your fight against the cold, your clothes. Unlike today, when most of us change into pajamas, or let's be honest, sometimes just a t-shirt, medieval people often went to sleep bundled up like travelers heading out on a winter's journey. Clothing itself became armor against the night. The staple, a nightshirt. Picture a long, loose linen tunic, simple and practical. Linen was easy to wash compared to wool, smooth against the skin and breathable. But linen alone wasn't enough when the frost crept through stone walls. Over it, people layered wool cloaks, tunics, even spare coats. The colder the night, the more fabric you piled on. And then came the real star of medieval nightwear, the nightcap. These snug cloth caps tied under the chin or pulled down over the ears. To us, they might look comical, but back then they were as essential as a blanket. Why? Because people believed quite sensibly that most heat escaped through the head. Without a cap, you were exposed. Illuminated manuscripts even show figures in bed with their heads neatly wrapped, like they were more ready to ride a horse than drift into dreams. Poor families often reused whatever they had, an old tunic, a patched cloak, socks tied around ankles. Wealthier nobles commissioned special nightshirts embroidered at the cuffs, or hoods lined with fur for extra warmth. Some ladies even wore sleeping hoods with trailing ribbons, though I can't help but imagine how impractical that must have been when you turned over in bed. It wasn't just about warmth. Modesty mattered too. With so many people sharing beds, siblings, servants, travelers, being half-dressed or naked was unacceptable. Even married couples were often depicted sleeping with caps and long shirts. Bedtime wasn't undressing. It was dressing differently. And then there were the little tricks, wrapping feet in strips of wool, binding hands in cloth to create makeshift socks and mittens. Medical texts even advised binding extremities to stop night air from stealing body heat. You can almost feel it, the scratch of wool against your toes, the press of cloth around your hands, the snug cap muting sound as you drift into uneasy sleep. The sensory world was vivid, the linen shirt cool and faintly scratchy until it warmed, the smell of wool earthy and lanolin rich, the cap pressing gently around your ears, cocooning you from the drafts. Bundled like this, people looked less like dreamers and more like travelers preparing for a long journey. In a way, they were, the journey through the hostile hours of the night. So next time you pull on your flannel pajamas or adjust the thermostat, picture the medieval sleeper tying on a nightcap, wrapping their feet, and tugging a cloak close. Their bedtime routine wasn't about relaxation. It was survival, stitch by stitch, layer by layer. Hey guys, imagine this. You've just finished your prayers, you're swaddled in layers of wool and linen, and you're about to slip under the blankets. But the thought of lying down on sheets as cold as slabs of ice makes you shiver before you even touch them. What do? In a world without central heating, people got creative. Enter the warming pan, a brass or copper pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals. A servant would slide it back and forth between the sheets, the metal hissing as sparks inside glowed red. For a few minutes, your bed transformed from a freezing prison into something almost welcoming. But it wasn't just noble families who sought warmth this way. Ordinary households, especially in colder regions, used simpler tools. Some filled clay pots with embers, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them at the foot of the bed. Others heated smooth stones by the hearth, then swaddled them in fabric to create what we'd call an early hot water bottle. In some places, even bags of sand were heated and slipped under the covers, an ingenious way to hold warmth longer than stone. The ritual wasn't without risks. Leave the pan in one place too long and the sheets could scorch, or worse, ignite. Stories survive of houses going up in flames because someone got careless with a coal pan. Think about that. You go to bed chasing warmth, and you wake up to your chamber on fire. Yet people took the risk because the alternative was shivering for hours before the blankets finally warmed. And here's a detail that shows how much people fused survival with belief. Some households sprinkled herbs, lavender, rosemary, thyme, directly onto the coals before sliding the pan across the sheets. The smoke carried a sharp, sweet fragrance, thought not only to purify the air, but also to guard against illness. Imagine the mingling scents: wood smoke, smoldering herbs, the tang of heated metal, all settling into the blankets you were about to sleep under. Even the Victorians, centuries later, clung to this habit. In fact, in some households, the warming pan became such a standard bedtime tool that inns were judged by whether they offered one. No pan. Guests would grumble that the establishment was unfit for decent travelers. But for all the comfort it offered, the warming pan, was never a permanent solution. The heat faded quickly, gone within minutes, leaving you to rely once again on your own body heat and heavy blankets. Still, that fleeting warmth could mean the difference between falling asleep peacefully and lying awake, teeth chattering, until exhaustion finally took you. So the warming pan became more than just a tool. It was a ritual, a moment of relief at the end of the day. A promise that, however briefly, the cold could be pushed back. And for those first few minutes as you slid under the covers, it felt almost like you'd stolen a piece of summer in the dead of winter. You've pulled the bed curtains shut. You're buried under layers of wool and fur, but the cold still creeps in through every crack. Your toes feel numb and your breath hangs like smoke in the air. Then suddenly, you feel something warm press against your feet. It's not another blanket, it's a dog. That's right. In the Middle Ages, and long after into the Victorian era, animals weren't just companions. They were heaters. Big hounds curled at the foot of the bed, smaller lap dogs nestled against the chest. Even cats tucked themselves into the crook of a sleeper's knees. Their thick coats radiated heat, and their steady breathing created a rhythm of comfort that no pile of blankets could match. And it wasn't only nobles who enjoyed this. Peasants shared cottages with their animals out of necessity. Chickens, goats, even calves were often stabled under the same roof. At night, when families huddled close, those animals added precious degrees of warmth. Imagine the scent: hay, smoke, wool, fur, all mingling together as children drifted off with the sound of sheep shifting nearby. Of course, it wasn't always pleasant. Dogs tracked in dirt and sometimes fleas. Chickens weren't exactly silent companions. But when the choice was between a few extra scratches or freezing through the night, the decision was simple. People chose warmth over cleanliness every time. Victorian families, especially in rural areas, carried the same tradition. Small lap dogs became so beloved that they were even gifted to women not just as pets, but as literal comfort animals meant to warm beds. Wealthy ladies in England sometimes pampered little spaniels or toy breeds with ribbons and perfume. But their truest value came when the night turned bitter, and those tiny bodies became living hot water bottles. There's even an old saying you might have heard: a three-dog night. It comes from the idea that one dog in bed meant it was cold, two dogs meant it was bitter, and three dogs. That meant the night was so freezing that only a pile of furry companions could keep you alive until morning. Think about that for a second. Castles with towering walls, grand estates with carved fireplaces. And yet, when winter dug in, survival sometimes came down to sharing your bed with a loyal hound. It's a reminder that the bond between humans and animals wasn't just emotional, it was practical. They protected, they hunted, and when the fire dimmed and the frost crept in, they kept us warm. So the next time your dog curls up by your feet, think of those long ago winters when that simple gesture wasn't just sweet, it was life-saving. Hey guys, let's flip the scene for a moment. You might think a nobleman in his castle had it better than a peasant in his cottage. Rich tapestries, feather beds, fur blankets, servants to stoke the fire. Surely that meant comfort, right? But here's the twist. Sometimes the peasants actually slept warmer. Castles were built for defense, not for coziness. Their chambers were cavernous, with ceilings so high your voice echoed and stone walls that sucked away every bit of warmth. Even if you had a roaring fireplace, the heat rarely reached beyond a small circle in front of the flames. Nobles would sit practically on top of the fire with cloaks over their heads, while just a few steps away their servants stamped their feet in the cold. Peasants, by contrast, lived in much smaller spaces. Timber cottages with thatched roofs insulated with straw held warmth far better than stone towers. A single hearth in the center of the room heated the entire house. Families huddled close, and often animals were stabled under the same roof. Imagine the combined heat of people. Cows, goats, and chickens, cramped, yes, but surprisingly snug. Of course, peasants didn't have feather beds or fine linens. Their bedding was coarse wool, straw mattresses, and rough sheepskins that smelled of lanolin and smoke. But while it wasn't luxurious, it was practical. A peasant family might fall asleep on a straw mattress near the fire, children curled like kittens beside their parents, the hearth's glow warming every corner of the room. Meanwhile, a nobleman might be buried under furs in his grand bed, but his chamber still felt like an ice cave. His breath turned to mist in the air, and frost sometimes formed on the inside of the window shutters. One traveler even wrote with astonishment that the humble huts of English villagers were warmer than the Lord's stone tower. So who truly slept better? That depends. Nobles had better materials, more layers, and servants to tend their fires. But peasants had smaller, tighter spaces where heat actually stayed. Wealth bought grandeur, but not always comfort. And that's the fascinating irony. Status shaped how people looked, what they ate, and where they slept. But when the cold of winter pressed in, everyone faced the same truth. Warmth wasn't just about riches. It was about closeness, about fire, and about adapting your space to survive. So next time you imagine the good life inside a medieval or Victorian castle, remember this. Sometimes the humblest cottage held more genuine warmth than the grandest hall. Here's something that might surprise you. In our world, a bedroom is permanent. You pick a spot, furnish it, and that's where you sleep for years. But in the Middle Ages and even into the Victorian era, sleeping chambers were flexible. People actually moved where they slept depending on the season. Think about it. Castles and manor houses were massive stone structures. Some rooms faced the sun, others sat in shade all day. And in winter, every ray of sunlight mattered. That's why noble families often shifted into what were called winter chambers. These rooms faced south, catching the weak light of the sun, and were usually smaller, easier to heat, and close to a fireplace. When summer came, they abandoned them and moved into north-facing chambers where the air stayed cooler. This wasn't just a little shuffle of furniture. Records show entire beds were dismantled, hauled piece by piece, and reassembled in a different chamber when the season turned. Imagine servants carrying carved oak posts, feather mattresses, and heavy curtains up and down staircases, setting up an entirely new nest depending on the time of year. It was a logistical headache, but survival demanded it. Even royalty followed this rhythm. King Edward Roman IV household accounts describe how beds, tapestries, and hangings were moved seasonally. One courtier even complained in a letter that frost conquered his chamber so completely one year that he refused to sleep there, retreating instead to a smaller room where the morning sun could reach him. It's striking, isn't it? Even lords and ladies felt as though the cold was an adversary that had to be fought with strategy. Peasants did the same thing in simpler ways. In winter, families dragged their pallets or straw mattresses close to the hearth, practically sleeping in the same room where they cooked. In summer, they might climb into lofts or barns where the air moved more freely and smoke didn't choke them. Their bedroom wasn't a fixed space. It was wherever warmth or coolness could be found. So when you imagine a medieval or Victorian household, don't picture a master bedroom that stood unchanged for decades. Picture instead a family on the move within their own walls, like migratory birds shifting with the seasons. Beds weren't monuments. They were tools of survival, dragged toward the sun in January and away from it in July. It's a reminder that medieval and Victorian life wasn't static. Every choice, from where you slept to how you dressed, was dictated by the seasons. Survival meant adapting again and again to the turning of the earth. Let's step closer to the walls for a moment. Imagine standing in front of a medieval or early Victorian window. Today, you'd expect glass panes, maybe double glazed, sealed tight against the wind. But back then, a window was more like a hole in the wall, a weak point where the cold slipped in like a thief. Most castles didn't have glass at all. If they did, the precious panes were reserved for chapels or the Lord's private oratory. Ordinary chambers had only shutters, thick planks of wood that you could bar at night. In theory, they kept the weather out. In reality, they rattled in the wind, leaked drafts through cracks, and groaned like old doors. Sleepers quickly learned that a closed shutter didn't mean safety from the cold. So people improvised. One method was to stretch cloth over the opening. Linen soaked in oil or wax worked best. It resisted rain, let in a dull amber glow by day, and slowed the wind at night. Picture it. Your chamber lit by a hazy golden light, like sunlight seen through parchment. It wasn't cozy, but it was better than staring into black emptiness while the winter air poured in. And then there were horn windows, sheets of animal horn, scraped thin and set into frames until they turned translucent. They blurred the world outside into a foggy smear, but they held back wind better than cloth. Imagine looking through one and seeing the moon as a pale blur, branches shifting like shadows underwater, beautiful in its own eerie way, but also a reminder of how desperate people were to keep the frost out. Still, no matter how clever the design, drafts always found their way in. Servants stuffed moss, straw, or rags into cracks. Some even pressed clay around the frames as makeshift insulation. It was ugly, temporary, and messy. But when your room was close to freezing, appearances didn't matter. Peasants faced the same battle in their cottages. Many had no windows at all, just narrow slits they could shutter at night. Some stretched animal bladder thin across openings to let light in. At night, frost turned the membrane into brittle sheets of ice, so that when morning came, it glittered like a frozen veil. Children sometimes woke to frost clinging to their hair because the cold seeped in so mercilessly. And here's the irony. Nobles, sleeping high in their towers, were often colder than peasants in low cottages. The higher the room, the harsher the wind. Guests wrote about climbing to their chambers and feeling the temperature drop with every step. A peasant in a thatched hut might envy the Lord's riches, but not the drafts whistling through a tower chamber window. So, when you picture a medieval or Victorian night, don't imagine a cozy nook with glass panes. Picture instead rattling shutters, cloth that flapped like sails, horn that blurred the world outside, and frost creeping in no matter what you tried. The window was never a barrier. It was a reminder. Winter always found a way in. Let's step closer to the hearth, because this was the beating heart of every medieval and Victorian household. When we think of a fireplace today, we imagine warmth spreading through a whole room. But in the centuries before central heating, that was mostly a dream. Picture the great stone fireplace in a castle chamber. its mouth yawning wide enough to swallow whole logs or even small trees. Flames roar, sparks leap, smoke curls upward. You'd think that meant salvation from the cold. But step back more than a few paces and your breath still fogs in the air. The heat raced upward with the smoke, vanishing through massive chimneys that acted less like funnels and more like escape routes. The result? A paradox. The fire was alive, but the room stayed dead with cold. People learned to treat the fireplace like an oasis. Sit right in front of it and your face flushed until it prickled. But your back, still icy. And when you finally crawled into bed across the chamber, it might as well have been outdoors. The fuel cost was enormous. Letters from lords complained bitterly that heating one great hall devoured entire forests. Wagon after wagon of timber rolled in, vanishing into hungry flames. Nobles could afford it, but the waste shocked even contemporaries. Guests joked that fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox but too weak to warm a man. The humor was cruel because it was true. Some households tried to outsmart physics. They lined hearths with tiles to store residual heat or placed iron firebacks to reflect warmth into the room. It helped, but only in the smallest ways. Fires never conquered the cold, they only carved out tiny islands of relief. Now contrast that with peasants. Their cottages had central hearths, smaller, smokier, but placed at the literal heart of the room. The space was tight, animals often stabled at one end, bodies crowded together, and so the fire's heat actually filled the hut. It might sting the eyes with smoke, but it kept the family alive. The irony. Grandeur meant spectacle, but sometimes a humble hearth in a cottage worked better for survival. And yet the ritual of the fire mattered, maybe even more than its heat. Families gathered by it, prayed by it, told stories by it. The glow carved out a fragile circle of safety in the vast, dark cold. Even when the flames failed to warm the chamber, they warmed the spirit. So when you imagine a winter night in the past, don't see a fireplace as salvation. See it as compromise. A fire was never enough to fight off the frost completely, but without it no one would have survived. If the fire was the heart of the house, then smoke was its shadow. You couldn't have one without the other. And believe me, the shadow was everywhere. Step into a medieval or Victorian room after the fire's been burning all day. The air is thick, the walls darkened, your eyes sting almost instantly. Chimneys then weren't like ours. They were wide, crude, and unpredictable. Smoke didn't always rise neatly up and out. Sometimes it swirled back down, filling the chamber with a choking haze. If the wind shifted outside, it could push the smoke straight into your face. One monk in northern England wrote in his journal that he coughed more than he prayed during winter, thanks to the soot that coated his tiny cell. Noble women complained that their gowns, freshly laundered, turned gray within weeks. Tapestries turned dull, ceilings streaked black. Even food tasted faintly of ash. Imagine trying to drift off to sleep while your throat burns and your hair smells like a campfire. Peasants had it even worse. Most cottages didn't even have chimneys. The smoke just rose into the rafters, thickening under the thatch until it seeped slowly out. Children grew up under this haze, their lungs blackening before adulthood. And yet people accepted it. Some even believed the smoke preserved timber and kept pests away. A strange comfort when the cost was your breath. The sensory world was unforgettable. Blankets that carried the acrid smell of burnt oak. Curtains heavy with soot. Straw on the floor gathering black dust until it had to be swept away, though it never really left. People washed their faces each morning with gritty hands, scraping soot from skin before starting another smoky day. And here's the cruelest irony. They hated it, but they needed it. No fire meant freezing to death. A smoky chamber was miserable, but at least it kept you alive. It was a bargain everyone made winter after winter. So when you picture a grand hall with its roaring hearth, don't imagine cozy warmth. Imagine coughing, watery eyes, and a lingering bitterness on your tongue. Fire was a savior, yes, but one that always demanded sacrifice. Picture this. The fire in the hearth has sunk into glowing embers. The room is vast, shadowy, and cold seeps through every crack in the stone. What's left to fight it? Just a candle. A fragile flame no taller than your thumb, and yet it mattered more than you can imagine. In wealthy houses, candles were made of beeswax. Their flames burned bright, steady, with a faint sweetness in the air, almost like honey drifting through the room. They were expensive, reserved for chapels, ceremonies, or the Lord's chamber. Most people relied on tallow candles instead, molded from animal fat. These smoked, sputtered, and smelled harsh, like cooking grease gone stale. Imagine trying to fall asleep with that smell thick in your nostrils, mixed with wool, sweat, and damp straw. But here's the thing. Candles weren't just about light. In a world where every degree of warmth counted, even the tiny heat of a flame mattered. Hold your hand near one and you'd swear your skin softened against the cold. Place a cluster of candles by the bed, and the fabric of your curtains grew faintly warm to the touch. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something could mean survival. Of course, danger lurked in every flicker. Bed curtains were made of wool and linen, heavily flammable. Records tell of whole chambers lost to a single toppled candle. There's even one story from Germany about a young squire who nodded off with a candle perched on his bed rail. He woke to find his blankets ablaze and barely escaped. People whispered that he was reckless, but in truth, he was just desperate. Desperate for warmth. There are letters from noble women demanding a dozen candles burning in their rooms through the night. Servants grumbling at the waste, while knowing their mistress might actually sleep warmer because of it. And in monasteries, small lamps burned steadily in dormitories, not only for prayer, but because even monks understood the comfort of light. The sensory world was unforgettable. Wax dripping in slow rivulets down a holder, the faint hiss of a wick catching smoke, shadows jumping and twisting against the stone walls. That golden circle of safety, shrinking the darkness into something you could manage, even if only in your imagination. So next time you flip a switch in your bedroom without a second thought, imagine lying in bed centuries ago, trusting your entire night to a fragile flame. A companion, a comfort, and a risk that could burn your world to the ground. Let's step away from the noble chambers for a moment and walk into a dormitory. Not the cozy kind you might remember from college, but a cavernous medieval hall where dozens of people slept side by side. Privacy didn't exist here. Warmth came not from thick blankets or furs, but from numbers, from bodies packed close enough that you could hear every cough, every turn, every snore. In monasteries, rules dictated simplicity. Monks weren't allowed feather beds or embroidered curtains. Instead, their dormitories were long stone halls lined with plain cots or straw pallets. Imagine the sound at night. A chorus of snores rising like waves, coughs echoing off vaulted ceilings, the shuffle of wool blankets scratching against skin. The air was cold and damp, but strangely not as brutal as the isolated chambers of nobles. Why? Because bodies together raise the temperature, even if just a little. One chronicler actually wrote that monks slept warmer than lords, not because of luxury, but because they slept like sheaves of wheat, bound tightly together. Soldiers lived in much the same way. Barracks or campaign tents lined with straw, men packed shoulder to shoulder, cloaks pulled over their heads. The smell must have been overwhelming. Sweat, leather, smoke, unwashed feet. But after days of marching or fighting, even that chaos felt like comfort. Safety wasn't silence. Safety was knowing your comrades lay so close that the cold couldn't fully get in. Servants in castles found corners of their own, side chambers, lofts above kitchens, even pallets rolled out under staircases. They didn't have the luxury of four-poster beds, but they had proximity. Smaller rooms, crowded with people, stayed warmer than vast chambers built for display. In a strange way, they may have slept better than their masters. The sensory details of these communal nights were unforgettable. Rough wool scratching your chin, the straw beneath you crackling with each shift, the smell of smoke clinging to everything. The rhythm of breathing all around you, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Rats scurried across the rushes on the floor, but exhaustion dulled the fear. So ask yourself, would you rather lie alone in a freezing, echoing castle chamber or curl up in a crowded dormitory where the air was foul but the cold less biting? For medieval people, the answer was often simple. Survival outweighed solitude. Warmth outweighed dignity. And so, night after night, they chose community over comfort. Let's imagine the rhythm of a medieval night. Today, we think of sleep as a single block, 8 hours if we're lucky. But for centuries, people expected something very different, segmented sleep. It wasn't unusual to drift into what they called first sleep, wake around midnight, and then slip into a second sleep before dawn. What happened in between those two sleeps tells us everything about how survival and ritual intertwined. In castles, someone always had to rise to tend the fire. Imagine dragging yourself from bed, your breath a puff of white in the icy air, straw crunching underfoot as you crossed the chamber. Your fingers stung while you poked at the dying embers, whispering a prayer that they would catch. Sparks flared, smoke hissed, and at last warmth pulsed back into the room. It wasn't comfort. It was duty, because without fire no one else would sleep again. Peasant cottages followed the same rhythm. Their hearths were open flames on the floor with no grates or chimneys. Too much neglect and the fire went out. Too little care, and sparks spread through the thatch. Families took turns waking in the dark hours to poke logs, add kindling, and keep the blaze alive. Sleep was never passive. It was a negotiation, guarded hour by hour. But not all midnight waking was drudgery. Medical writers of the time even encouraged it. One 15th century physician suggested using the interval between first and second sleep for prayer, conversation, or intimacy, claiming it was the most natural rhythm for the human body. And indeed, many households treated it that way. Couples whispered to each other, parents checked on children, monks rose to chant, soldiers inspected their weapons before lying back down. Think of the soundscape. In a monastery, bells might ring at midnight, pulling men from their cots into the chapel for prayer. In a castle, the shuffle of a servant crossing the chamber broke the silence as he carried a log to the hearth. In a cottage, the crackle of new wood flared just as children stirred and sighed in their sleep. Darkness wasn't absolute stillness. It was a living, breathing pause punctuated by ritual. Ask yourself, how different would your nights feel if you always woke at midnight, not by accident but by design? Would the hours seem lonely or strangely intimate? For medieval people, this was simply normal. Sleep was segmented, survival depended on vigilance, and the night was never one long escape but two careful retreats, stitched together by fire and habit. Picture this. You've tended the fire, you've wrapped yourself in layers of wool, and yet the cold still seeps into your bones. What else could you do? For the fortunate few, the answer was luxury, rituals that transformed bedtime into a fleeting victory over winter. A hot bath before bed was almost magical. Imagine a wooden tub hauled into a chamber, lined with cloth, and filled with steaming water. Servants poured bucket after bucket, steam curling into the candlelight. Herbs like rosemary or thyme floated on the surface, filling the air with fragrance. A noblewoman might sink into the water, cheeks flushed, skin prickling with heat. For a brief moment she felt invincible, as though winter itself had been banished. When she finally stepped out, wrapped in warmed linens, and slid into her bed, she carried that glow with her. Of course, such indulgence was rare. Heating that much water devoured fuel, and for most households, baths were a luxury reserved for feast days or special occasions. More common were small comforts, a cup of mulled wine spiced with cinnamon and cloves, or hot ale poured thick into a wooden cup. That first sip spread heat through the chest, loosening stiff muscles and quieting anxious minds. Picture yourself in a smoky hall, the tang of cloves in your nose, the sweetness of honey on your tongue. By the time you blew out the candle, sleep didn't feel like surrender. It felt like relief. Then there were the clever little tricks. Stones warmed in the hearth and wrapped in cloth, tucked at the foot of the bed like primitive hot water bottles. Some families even filled leather pouches with heated sand, which molded to the shape of the body and stayed warm longer than stone. Imagine the joy of stretching your frozen toes toward such a pouch, sighing as the pain of cold slowly eased. Of course, these luxuries never lasted. The water cooled, the drink emptied, the stones lost their heat. But that was never the point. These rituals bought a few precious minutes of ease, enough to lull the body into slumber before the night's frost reclaimed its territory. They were moments of grace, psychological armor against an enemy that could never be beaten completely. Think of how different that feels compared to us today. We flip on central heating, we take comfort for granted. But for a medieval family, a hot drink or a warm stone wasn't just a treat. It was survival, wrapped in ritual. Let's step into a medieval chamber again, but this time, don't just notice the fire or the blankets. Look closer, see that sprig of herbs tied above the bed. Smell the faint sharpness of juniper in the smoky air. Hear the whispered prayers before the candle is snuffed. These weren't just habits. They were defenses as important as cloaks or furs. To the medieval mind, night wasn't only cold, it was dangerous. Darkness itself seemed alive, carrying illness, bad spirits, or unseen forces that slipped through cracks as easily as drafts of wind. And so, people armed themselves with more than cloth. They armed themselves with belief. Amulets were common. Some households hung small crosses carved from wood above the bed. Others tucked relics or pouches of herbs beneath the pillow. Rue, mugwort, rosemary, and juniper were favorites, each believed to chase away not only sickness but evil itself. Imagine lying under a canopy where little bundles of herbs dangled, their fragrance cutting through the heaviness of smoke and damp wool. Prayers, too, became nightly rituals. Monks recited psalms in cold dormitories, their breath clouding as their voices rose in unison. Nobles whispered paternosters at their bedside, while peasants muttered half-spell, half-prayer charms, crossing themselves as they pulled the blankets tight. Parents pressed kisses onto children's foreheads, whispering words to keep away the night hag, a spirit blamed for suffocating sleepers. Iron was another weapon. Yes, iron. Many people slipped knives or scissors beneath the bed, believing the cold gleam of metal repelled demons or fairies. Imagine lying down with the comfort of knowing a blade, hidden but present, guarded you from whatever prowled in the shadows. Even warmth itself took on mystical rules. Some believed that turning shoes upside down beside the bed kept frost from biting toes. Others whispered the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle, trusting their body heat would not escape in the night. To us, these might sound quaint, but for them they were serious protections. After all, when every breath of cold felt like a threat, why wouldn't you clutch at every charm, every prayer, every scrap of hope? The sensory details are striking. The rustle of herbs brushing the canopy, the faint metallic smell of iron near your head, the warmth of wool against your skin, mixed with the acrid tang of smoke. Every sense reminded you that the night was uncertain, that sleep itself was a gamble, and that survival demanded not just physical preparation, but spiritual armor as well. Peasants, of course, practiced the same in their simpler way. Instead of relics, they hung knotted cords, crude carvings, or sprigs of garlic under pillows. They blessed their animals before nightfall, believing that the shared breath of cow or sheep was itself a protection against frost and spirits alike. So when you think of medieval sleep, don't imagine it as only a battle against temperature. Imagine it as a battle of faith and superstition, where every herb, every prayer, every whispered word was one more weapon against the cold, the dark, and the unknown. Hey guys, imagine stepping into a medieval bedchamber, not the vast echoing hall where feasts shook the rafters, but a smaller, tighter space tucked higher in the keep. This room wasn't designed for luxury the way we think of it. It was designed as a compromise, a fragile balance between defense and survival. The first thing you'd notice is the walls. Stone, always stone. Thick, damp, and merciless. But medieval people didn't accept bare walls without a fight. They covered them. Tapestries weren't just pretty pictures of saints or hunts. They were survival gear, heavy wool or silk hangings that softened the space. Step close to one and you'd smell lanolin, that faint waxy scent of sheep, earthy and comforting in its own way. Behind the cloth, the wall still wept with damp, but at least you weren't staring directly into the fortress itself. Wood, too, became a weapon against the cold. Paneling made from oak was nailed against stone, not because it looked elegant, though it often did, but because it trapped little pockets of air. Servants stuffed moss, straw, even scraps of cloth between the boards, plugging gaps like soldiers defending a breach. It wasn't insulation as we know it, but it bought you just enough warmth to believe the chamber was yours, not the cold's. Some rooms were designed with warmth in mind. The solar, for example, was a smaller, more intimate chamber reserved for the lord and his closest family. Positioned high and often facing south, it caught whatever weak sunlight winter could offer. A hearth blazed there, smaller but more efficient than the one below in the great hall. Curtains hung thick, rugs muffled steps. Compared to the cavernous spaces downstairs, this was a sanctuary. Still cold, yes, but manageable. Think about the effort behind this. Nobles hauled their tapestries with them when they traveled from castle to castle. Imagine the servants struggling with rolls of heavy cloth, more precious than furniture itself. Why? Because without those hangings, the walls turned every chamber into a cave. A lord without his tapestries was like a knight without armor. Now, let's bring this image to life. You close the door of your solar, and the roar of the wind in the corridor fades. The room glows with crimson and gold threads woven into the wall cloth. A fire snaps in the hearth, its smoke twisting into the hooded chimney. The ceiling is lower, the space smaller, the sound softer. Your breath still fogs, but it doesn't cut as sharply in your lungs. And here's where the psychology mattered. Maybe the tapestry didn't truly raise the temperature by more than a degree or two. Maybe the paneling did little more than stop the worst of the draft. But perception mattered. To walk into a room glowing with color, smelling of wool and oak, hearing fire pop against logs, was to feel warmer. And sometimes, feeling warmer was half the battle. Peasants used their own tricks. They plastered walls with clay, lined them with wattles, or tacked up rough cloth. Brightly painted sheets added both cheer and draft protection. Children slept in lofts above kitchens, warmed by the day's cooking. It wasn't tapestry or silk, but it was the same impulse. Turn stone, wood, or mud into something human. So when you think of a medieval bedroom, don't picture bare stone and endless echo. Picture a room patched together with every trick: cloth, wood, moss, sunlight. Picture people fighting back against the cold, not with central heating, but with layers, colors, and ingenuity. Every wall was a negotiation, every corner a reminder that survival wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The castle might have been built for war, but inside, people tried desperately to build a home. Hey guys, close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking into a medieval bedroom. Before you even notice the fire, before you feel the blankets, what hits you first is the smell. Because in the Middle Ages, smell wasn't just background. It was part of life, and it shaped the way people experienced sleep. The strongest note was always smoke. Fires burned almost constantly in winter, and chimneys were crude, so the soot drifted back into the room. It darkened walls, clung to hair, and soaked into the fabric of sheets. Even freshly laundered linen couldn't escape it. You'd lie down at night with smoke in your hair, on your clothes, in your breath, as if the fire had followed you beneath the covers. Then there was the smell of damp wool. Blankets were rarely truly dry. Moisture seeped through stone walls, condensed in the air, and soaked into every fiber. Wool holds onto that damp smell like a memory, earthy, heavy, almost sour. Pull the cover to your chin, and that's the air you'd breathe, warm against your skin but never quite fresh. The floor added its own scent. Rushes and straw scattered to soften steps and absorb spills started grassy and pleasant when new. But trampled, soaked, and forgotten, they turned musty. Add to that the smell of vermin, mice, insects making the rushes their playground. Imagine shifting in bed and smelling a puff of musty straw rise into the air. Herbs were the medieval answer. People sprinkled lavender, rosemary, chamomile, or mint among the rushes, hoping to disguise the odors. For a few days it worked. The room smelled faintly sweet, almost civilized, but soon the herbs wilted, crushed underfoot, their scent fading into the sourness of damp straw. And then there was the most human layer of all, sweat. Hygiene was rare, baths infrequent, and clothes were often worn to bed. Leather, wool, unwashed skin all carried their own smell. In shared beds, the air was thick with it, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Imagine lying shoulder to shoulder with family, breathing each other's warmth and each other's scent. To us today, it might sound unbearable, but to medieval people this was simply life. Smell was identity. Peasants expected the pungent odor of livestock in their cottages, cows, sheep, and chickens sharing the same roof. Nobles disguised their chambers with perfumes, incense, or scented oils, but even their silks and tapestries couldn't hide the underlying truth. Smoke, wool, straw, and sweat were the foundation of medieval air. Now picture yourself lying in bed. The fire is low. Your blanket is damp but warm against your chin. The straw beneath your mattress sighs as you shift, releasing a musty breath. Your companion exhales beside you, his breath heavy with ale. Somewhere beneath it all, a faint trace of rosemary still lingers, almost lost. This is the sensory world of medieval sleep. Not crisp linen and fresh air, but a stew of odors, intimate and unrelenting. And here's the surprising part. Over time, familiarity itself became a comfort. To breathe smoke and wool and straw was to breathe home. These smells told you where you belonged, and in their own way they were as much a blanket as the fur across your chest. Let's shift the scene for a moment. Before you even climb into bed in the Middle Ages, survival started at the dinner table. What you ate and drank before sleep mattered just as much as the blankets you pulled over yourself. Food was warmth. Food was medicine. And sometimes, food was the difference between life and death on a freezing night. Think of the peasant family, huddled close to the hearth as a cauldron bubbled with pottage. It wasn't glamorous. A stew of barley, peas, leeks, maybe a turnip or two, but it was heavy. It clung to the ribs. When you went to bed, that weight in your stomach worked like insulation, radiating heat outward. Children licked wooden spoons clean before curling together on straw pallets, their bellies lined with the warmth of the meal. For nobles, the recipe grew richer. Their stews were thick with meat, cream, and exotic spices brought by long trade routes. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves. A cup of spiced wine called hippocras turned the whole chamber fragrant. Imagine sipping that sweet, burning drink by firelight. The cinnamon hits your nose first, then the warmth travels down your chest, tricking you into believing the cold can't reach you. Even medicine of the day leaned on food as heat. A 15th century physician once wrote that leeks eaten before bed drove away the chill of death. Garlic was a favorite too. Farmers chewed cloves before lying down, believing it kept frostbite away. Maybe it was circulation, maybe it was superstition. Either way, the sharp, pungent scent filled the chamber as strongly as smoke. And then there were drinks. Ale was everywhere. Thick, warm, and calorie-heavy, it fueled peasants and nobles alike. Mead, honey-sweet and golden, was recommended for the elderly, its heat said to strengthen the humors. We might smile at the old medical language, but think about it. Have you ever sipped hot tea before bed and felt your body loosen, your eyelids grow heavy? For them, mulled wine or ale did the same, lulling the body into surrender. Of course, not everyone agreed on how much these foods really helped. Some believed alcohol only dulled the senses, making you think you were warmer than you were. Others swore by the calories and heat, arguing that no blanket worked without a heavy meal first. But everyone, from lord to shepherd, leaned on food as a final defense. Picture yourself in that moment now. A servant hands you a wooden cup. Steam curls into the air, carrying the scent of cloves and honey. You sip, and warmth blossoms in your chest. Your stomach feels heavy but satisfied. When you finally crawl into bed, the blankets no longer feel oppressive. They feel like partners to the meal you just had. Warmth outside, warmth inside. 2 layers of armor against the cold. So in the medieval night, supper wasn't just nourishment. It was part of the survival ritual. Every spoonful of pottage, every swallow of hot drink was another layer of protection. Without it, the cold was sharper, the blankets thinner, the night longer. With it, you stood a chance. If strong knights and hard-working peasants struggled through winter nights, imagine what it was like for the most fragile, the children and the elderly. These were the lives most at risk when the frost crept into every chamber. A healthy adult could shiver and endure until morning, but a baby could turn blue-lipped in an hour, and an old woman might never wake again. Families knew this, and so survival meant extra care. In peasant cottages, children didn't get their own rooms. They were swaddled in layer after layer of cloth and tucked near the fire. Babies often slept in wicker cradles set directly by the hearth, their faces glowing red in the embers' light. And sometimes mothers brought infants right into their own beds, shielding them with body heat as if their very flesh was another blanket. For nobles, the ritual grew more elaborate. Chronicles describe cribs wrapped in furs and draped with tiny canopies, positioned where the fire's warmth lingered longest. Nursemaids kept watch, rocking children and humming softly, while servants added logs to keep flames alive. And yet, even with all that care, winter still claimed young lives. Medieval parents carried the constant fear that one night's frost might take their child before morning. The elderly faced their own battles. Frail bodies produced less heat and tolerated fewer drafts. In cottages, grandparents were given the place of honor, closest to the fire. Younger adults accepted colder corners, while elders were tucked under the thickest cloaks. In castles, older nobles sometimes abandoned their lofty chambers entirely and moved into kitchens or bakehouses during winter. There's even a letter from Burgundy where an elderly matron insisted she only slept well beside the oven, saying the residual heat gave her a second youth. Doctors of the time understood the danger too. Medical texts warned that sudden chills could extinguish the flame of life. Remedies were prescribed. Heated stones wrapped in cloth for old feet, spiced wine for fragile stomachs, warm oils rubbed on cold limbs. Sometimes these worked. Other times they were simply comfort against the inevitable. Picture it now. A peasant cottage glowing faintly with embers. A grandmother snores softly in a chair pulled right to the hearth. A baby lies swaddled so tightly only its tiny face peeks out, skin flushed from the warmth of its mother's side. Children giggle and wriggle together on straw before finally falling silent. Meanwhile, in a castle chamber, a noblewoman clutches her rosary under heavy blankets while a servant slides hot stones near her feet. Both scenes, humble and grand, share the same fragility. The sensory details are haunting. The crackle of logs added carefully through the night, the faint rustle of swaddling cloth, the whispered prayers muttered over elders and infants alike. You feel the cold waiting outside like a predator ready to strike the weak first. And in that moment, you understand, medieval sleep was not equal for all. Children and elders carried the heaviest risks, and survival for them meant community. Every blanket, every ember, every hand stirring the fire at midnight was an act of protection. So when we think about winter nights in the past, we should remember not just the knights and nobles wrapped in fur, but also the fragile souls who depended on others' warmth to see the dawn. One thing we often forget is that cold in the pre-modern world wasn't just uncomfortable. It was considered dangerous to your health. Doctors of the Middle Ages and the Victorian era both believed that temperature had the power to shift the body's balance and invite illness. Back then, medical theory revolved around the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To keep them in harmony meant staying alive. Too much cold, they thought, could congeal the humors, clogging the body and turning healthy people sickly. And so the night became a battleground not just against frost, but against the very idea of imbalance inside the body. Medical texts from the 13th century suggest rubbing feet with warm oil before bed so the pores would open and chase away harmful chill. Another advised drinking heated milk with honey to keep the stomach soothed and the humors moving. By the 19th century, Victorians repeated the same logic, just wrapped in new words. Doctors told patients to sip hot cocoa, mulled wine, or even warm beer before bed, claiming it would fortify the nerves and prevent colds from settling in the lungs. Some remedies sound familiar. Herbal teas of chamomile or nettle were brewed to calm children and help them sleep warm. Others sound bizarre. Garlic rubbed on the soles of feet was thought to draw frost out of the body. In England, a medical herbal even recommended tying a live rooster in the room so it would absorb the chill before it reached the sleeper. Imagine trying to drift off with a squawking chicken by your bed. But there's a deeper truth here. These rituals, whether they worked or not, gave people a sense of control. When the stone walls themselves turned to ice, when your breath crystallized on the bed curtains, you needed more than blankets. You needed to believe you were doing something, however small, to tip the odds in your favor. Picture the scene. A servant massages rosemary oil into cold feet, the scent filling the chamber. A wooden cup of honeyed wine steams in your hand, warming your throat. A sprig of garlic hangs above the bed, sharp and pungent. Beneath the pillow, a small iron knife lies hidden, thought to ward off spirits that might strike in the vulnerable hours of sleep. The sensory world is layered. Herbs, smoke, wool, the faint sweetness of wine. Each detail is a kind of medicine, physical and spiritual at once. Peasants, too, had their nightly prescriptions. Women brewed simple teas for their children. Men wrapped wool soaked in vinegar around their legs to keep circulation strong. They didn't have physicians at hand, so their cures blended superstition with practicality. Maybe they worked, maybe they didn't. But for families who feared frostbite more than fever, these remedies felt essential. Looking back, we know smoke-filled rooms and damp blankets probably did more harm than good. Yet to medieval and Victorian minds, the greater danger was cold itself. Better to cough from smoke than to freeze in clean air. Better to smell of garlic than to risk waking blue-lipped. So when we think of sleep in a world without heat, we shouldn't imagine only blankets and fires. We should see medicine woven into the nightly ritual, oils, teas, charms, and whispered prayers, each one a kind of therapy against the creeping frost. Hey guys, let's take this even further. Imagine waking up not outside in the snow, but inside your own bedroom, and realizing the walls have grown a coat of frost. That was the reality in many castles and Victorian homes before central heating. Chroniclers tell us of noble women who wrote in letters that their bed curtains glittered as though stitched with silver. The truth was less romantic. The moisture from their own breath had frozen solid during the night. Archaeologists have found salt stains and moisture marks on preserved castle walls, proof that condensation froze again and again in winter. Servants scraped ice away in the mornings, only to see it creep back by nightfall. In Scandinavia, the stories grew even harsher. Some great halls saw icicles forming on rafters indoors, dripping onto unlucky sleepers below. Imagine drifting off beneath heavy furs and hearing the crack of ice above, wondering if a shard might fall on you. Servants hung cloths from beams to catch the meltwater, but it was only a partial defense. The cold was inside the house, part of the architecture itself. Victorians, though more modern in their construction, still lived with similar intrusions. Poorer families in drafty London homes woke to find the water in their wash basins frozen into glassy slabs. Diaries describe children tracing fingers through frost patterns on the inside of windows, treating it like artwork even while they shivered. Some parents joked grimly that their kids were sleeping with the clouds indoors. But behind the humor was a real danger. Frostbite, chilblains, and pneumonia all thrived in those conditions. And here's the haunting part. Even nobles with hot stones and fur-lined beds couldn't truly escape it. They might keep their bodies warm under the covers, but the air they breathed was still freezing. One English poet turned this misery into metaphor, saying that true love was like a bed without frost inside the hangings, meaning that warmth of the heart mattered as much as warmth of the fire. Picture yourself in such a room. You wake in the gray of dawn, your breath misting. You reach for the basin and your hand hits solid ice. The bed curtains are stiff with frozen crystals. The boards of the floor creak, shrunk brittle by the frost. Every movement feels like punishment, and the thought of leaving your blankets is unbearable. Peasants faced the same ordeal, though in humbler ways. Frost coated the inside of their thatched roofs, snow drifted down from rafters, and children woke with white crystals tangled in their hair. The cottage smelled of smoke and animals, but that heat could only fight back so much. Yet still they endured. They rose, scraped ice away, rekindled fires, and whispered jokes to soften the cruelty. So when we imagine sleep in the past, we can't separate it from this surreal beauty and brutality. The silver sparkle of ice on a canopy, the strange sight of breath turned into frost, the feeling of living half indoors and half outdoors. Castles may have kept armies away, but no stone wall could keep winter out. Let's step outside the castle walls and the manor houses for a moment. Imagine you're on the road, somewhere between towns, the wind cutting like knives through your cloak, and night is falling. Where do you sleep? How do you keep warm when you don't even have the drafty security of stone walls? For medieval travelers, the answer was often an inn. But inns back then were nothing like our cozy picture of fireplaces and private rooms. They were smoky, crowded, and loud. Beds were shared with strangers, 3, 4, sometimes more to a mattress. Imagine climbing onto a lumpy straw sack and squeezing between two men you'd never met before, their breath heavy with ale, the air thick with sweat and smoke. Privacy, forget it. But there was one thing those inns guaranteed: heat. The bodies themselves became insulation. As one Italian traveler joked, he didn't sleep well, but at least he didn't freeze. Some inns were even worse equipped, offering nothing more than a corner in a stable. At first that sounds humiliating, right? Sleeping with horses, cattle, or sheep. But for many travelers, the stable was the smarter choice. Animals radiated warmth like furnaces. Curling up against a hay bale with a cow nearby could be far cozier than a bed in a drafty upstairs chamber. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago even wrote that they sometimes chose the stalls, preferring the breath of animals to the icy air of unheated rooms. By the Victorian era, travel had improved. Stagey coaches, railroads, bustling inns. But the problem of warmth hadn't disappeared. Cheap lodgings in London were infamous. Cold, overcrowded, infested with vermin. Imagine a room where 20 men lay side by side on the floor, each with a thin blanket if they were lucky, their combined heat the only real defense against frost. Writers of the time described the air as thick with breath and misery. And yet, for many working poor, this was better than the streets. Hospitality still mattered in rural places. A peasant family might take in a weary traveler, offering a place by the fire or a patch of straw in the corner. The warmth came not from luxury, but from generosity and closeness. In France, some inns even had long wooden platforms covered in straw, where dozens of guests, men, women, children, lay shoulder to shoulder, their snores blending together like a choir of survival. Think about the choice they faced: cold isolation versus crowded discomfort. Which would you pick? A flea-ridden mattress beside strangers, or a bed alone in a freezing room where your breath turns to frost? For many, the answer was simple. You chose warmth, even if it meant sacrificing dignity. So picture it now. You walk into a noisy inn after a day of trudging through snow. The hall glows with firelight, mugs clatter, dogs bark, smoke coils through the rafters. You squeeze into a bed between strangers, straw scratching through thin sheets. The smell is a stew of sweat, ale, and smoke, but your toes thaw and at last your body begins to rest. It's not comfort as we know it, but it's survival. And in the end, that's what sleep has always been about: buying another dawn, no matter the cost. Imagine sitting by a low fire in a great hall or a Victorian workhouse, and someone begins to tell a story. Not a fairy tale, but a warning. Because in both the Middle Ages and the Victorian Age, the cold itself was a killer, and people never forgot it. One medieval chronicle from Flanders describes a siege where guards on the castle wall froze at their posts. By dawn, they were still upright, spears in hand, transformed into eerie statues of ice. Their comrades found them locked in silence, faces pale, eyes glazed, their watch fires long dead. To the chronicler, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was proof that winter itself was a weapon of war. Imagine that image spreading through the village, men turned into monuments of frost overnight. In Burgundy, a noblewoman wrote a letter about her Italian cousin who visited one winter. He trembled the entire night, unable to sleep, and begged for dawn as though light alone could save him. He survived, but the tale was retold with mockery. The southerner couldn't handle the northern cold, and yet beneath the laughter was real fear. Everyone knew that one bad night could tip the scales. Folk legends carried the same message. In Scandinavia, villagers whispered about a young bride who entered her new husband's castle and collapsed from the shock of the cold. They said she was cursed by the spirits of ice. Maybe she died of illness. Maybe exposure. Either way, her story lived on as a cautionary tale. Never underestimate the chill of stone chambers. And the Victorians, they had their own grim reminders. Newspaper reports in 19th century London often described beggars or chimney sweeps found frozen on doorsteps by morning. One particularly haunting story tells of a child who crawled under a bridge for shelter and was discovered stiff and silent, a thin blanket his only defense. Victorians read these reports with a mix of pity and fear because everyone knew it could just as easily have been them. Travelers, too, left warnings. Pilgrims wrote of companions lost on mountain passes, their bodies discovered in spring curled as if still asleep. Soldiers on campaign described waking to find their tent mates unmoving, cloaks stiff with frost. The line between rest and death blurred in the dark. One English poet even used it as a metaphor for love. A bed without frost inside the hangings, as if true warmth came not from fire, but from closeness with another person. Picture hearing these stories in a firelit room. The flames crackle, shadows dance on the walls, and the storyteller's voice lowers. Children clutch their cloaks tighter. Servants cross themselves. These weren't just tales for entertainment, they were survival lessons. Respect the night. Guard against the cold. Never assume that blankets alone will save you. And yet, for every chilling account of loss, there were also stories of triumph. Peasant families boasting of winters survived in smoky cottages. Nobles celebrating feasts in midwinter as proof that wealth conquered the season. For every man who froze, there were 10 who endured. And that endurance itself became a kind of victory. A reminder that human resilience could outlast even the fiercest winter. So when you imagine sleep in those centuries, remember both sides, the legends of those who succumbed and the quiet pride of those who endured. Every story carried a lesson. The cold was merciless, but survival was possible if you fought for it. Let's go back to the fire. Because if there was one thing both a medieval knight and a Victorian child understood, it was this. The hearth was not just heat, it was life itself. Picture a great medieval hall, its chimney yawning wide, whole trees tossed onto the flames. Sparks leap like fireflies, shadows stretch across stone, and the air is thick with smoke. It isn't efficient heat. Your face bakes while your back freezes, but it's the heart of the household. People gather here because without this blaze, the castle is unlivable. Now cross forward centuries to a cramped Victorian slum. A single fireplace crackles weakly, a kettle hissing above it. The fire isn't grand. It barely lights the room. But to the family huddled close, it is the only barrier between survival and despair. Children push their hands as near as they dare, cheeks red, eyes gleaming. Parents whisper, "Don't let it go out." It's the same prayer nobles once whispered in their stone keeps, and fire demanded constant sacrifice. A medieval lord might strip forests bare to feed his hearth. Letters survive where nobles complain that winter empties their woods faster than war. A Victorian matron, meanwhile, scrapes coins together for a bundle of coal, knowing that without it her children will shiver. Whether oak logs or black coal, the story was the same. Warmth cost dearly, and to run out was a sentence written in frost. But the fire was more than fuel, was spirit. In Germany, villagers circled their hearth before bed, stretching out their hands and whispering blessings as though flames carried prayers upward. In Victorian parlors, families told ghost stories by firelight, the dancing shadows making the unseen world feel closer. Fire wasn't just warmth. It was ritual, memory, and faith combined. Think of the sensory details. The snap of logs, the glow of embers, the taste of smoke on your tongue, the resin smell clinging to clothes. A dog curls nearby, sighing in its sleep. For peasants, nobles, workers, and children alike, this was the nightly chorus of survival. And the hearthkeeper, the one tasked to watch the embers, was no small role. In castles, entire servants were dedicated to tending flames so they never died. In Victorian workhouses, children were roused to stoke boilers at dawn. If the fire failed, life itself faltered. It was disgrace in a noble hall, disaster in a slum. So when you imagine those long nights, don't picture fire as just a background detail. It was the thin red line holding back death. A paradox, both savior and tormentor, provider and smoky tyrant, but always the center of the night. Without it, there was no home. Without it, there was no sleep. Let's linger by the embers for a moment. Because if fire was the heart of the house, the embers were its heartbeat, slower, quieter, but just as vital. Picture this. The great blaze of the evening has died down. No more roaring logs, no more sparks jumping like tiny fireworks. What's left is a bed of coals glowing faintly in the dark. They look fragile, yet for people in the Middle Ages or in Victorian London, these coals were survival itself. Medieval servants would creep through the hall, poking the embers with long irons, coaxing just enough heat to keep the chamber from turning into stone ice. Victorian families, too, had their ritual, covering the fire with ashes at night to bank it, keeping the coals alive until morning. If the flame died completely, it meant starting over, striking steel against flint, shivering while kindling caught. So people guarded the embers like treasure. And they weren't just heat, they were comfort. Imagine a child in a cottage waking in the night, glancing toward the hearth. The glow was faint but steady, like a night light of another age. For that child, the world felt less cruel because the coals still breathed. Even in the darkest hours, the fire had not abandoned them. The sensory world of embers was unforgettable. The faint crackle when you stirred them. The dull orange glow painting shadows across walls. The smell of ash, sharp but reassuring, clinging to your hair. If you held your hands close, the warmth wasn't fierce. It was gentle, like holding a sleeping animal. Enough to remind you that winter had not won. There are letters from Victorian households describing how women rose at dawn and stirred yesterday's ashes to life, coaxing sparks into flame for porridge or tea. The success or failure of those first moments could set the mood of the whole day. In castles, fire wardens did the same, crouching in silence, their breath fogging as they prayed the ember caught. You can almost hear the relief when it flared back to life. A hiss, a glow, a promise of another day. Think about that symbolism. Embers weren't just leftovers. They were continuity. They carried yesterday's fire into tomorrow, bridging night to morning, despair to hope. In a world where winters could kill, that fragile red glow was as important as any prayer, any charm, any blanket. So when you imagine medieval or Victorian sleep, don't picture roaring fireplaces lasting till dawn. Picture instead the hush of a room where everyone trusted those fading coals to hold out just long enough for morning light to return. The fire was always a bargain. It gave its strength in the evening, and in return, you had to guard its last breath till dawn. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you've just crawled into bed. The fire is low, the embers faint, and the room is dark except for the thin silver wash of moonlight creeping through a shutter crack. That's when the night begins to speak. The Middle Ages were never silent. Neither were the cramped houses of Victorian London. Sleep meant lying still while the world outside whispered, groaned, or roared its reminders that safety was never absolute. In a castle chamber, the first sound was the wind. Drafts slid through arrow slits, whistling like ghostly flutes. Sometimes they rattled shutters so hard it felt like someone was knocking at the window. In a peasant's cottage, the thatch above crackled as frost tightened its grip, or as a rat scurried through straw. In Victorian tenements, the sound might be the scuffle of feet on the floor above, the muffled crying of a baby in the next room, or the never-ending cough of coal smoke-choked lungs. Then there were the human noises. Monks in their dormitories coughed and shifted, the sound echoing off stone like a chorus of restless ghosts. In barracks, soldiers muttered in their sleep, calling out names or prayers, their voices tangled with snores. Families in cottages layered in one bed meant whispers, giggles, or arguments carried until exhaustion won. Dogs barked in the courtyards. Horses stamped in stalls. Owls cried from the rafters. And in the city streets of Victorian England, carriage wheels clattered, drunks sang, and watchmen shouted the hour. To us, this might sound unbearable, but to them it was normal. Silence, in fact, was the thing they feared, because silence meant the fire had died. Silence meant the hearth was cold. Silence meant no one was awake to watch the embers or guard the household. A little noise was proof of life. Still, the night was not without menace. People spoke of hearing the night hag pressing on their chest, what we now call sleep paralysis. Others swore they heard spirits in the draft or devils scratching at shutters. In Victorian slums, the sounds of rats gnawing near children's beds sparked real terror because vermin carried disease as much as fear. And yet, strangely, these sounds shaped comfort too. The steady breathing of a dog at your feet, the low hum of a neighbor's lullaby through thin walls. Even the creak of rafters could become familiar, a reminder that the house was still standing against the storm. Imagine lying there, listening. The wind rattles, the fire pops, someone shifts under heavy blankets. Your body aches with cold, but the soundtrack of the night is proof that you're not alone. Sleep came not in perfect silence, but in harmony with this rough, living orchestra of medieval and Victorian life. So next time you drift off in your own bed, think of how different the soundscape was for those before us. No humming heaters, no quiet insulation, just wind, fire, animals, and people all mixing into a restless lullaby, a lullaby of survival. Hey guys, we've traveled together through castles of stone, cottages of timber, and the crowded rooms of Victorian towns. We've felt the frost creep along the walls, smelled the smoke in the curtains, listened to dogs breathing at our feet, and heard the rattling of shutters in the wind. And after all of it, one truth shines through. Whether it was a noble wrapped in silks or a child swaddled near the hearth, survival on those winter nights was never about perfection. It was about resilience. People made do with whatever they had, layers of wool, the warmth of animals, a hot drink, or even just the closeness of another human being. The cold was relentless, yes, but so was the human spirit. Every blanket pulled tight, every prayer whispered, every ember coaxed back to life was an act of quiet defiance against the dark. That defiance is the same reason we're here tonight, telling these stories, because they remind us that no matter how harsh the night, people found ways to endure. So as you lie in your own bed now, maybe with the soft hum of heating, clean sheets, and light at the flick of a switch, take a moment to feel grateful. We sleep easier than any king or queen of the past, yet their struggle gives our comfort meaning. Close your eyes. Let the noise of today fall away. Imagine the embers glowing faintly in the hearth, the hush of winter wind fading beyond stone walls, the gentle sigh of a dog curling by your feet. You are warm. You are safe. And the night will carry you gently into dreams. Good night, my friends. Sleep well, and may your rest be deeper and more peaceful than any noble or peasant ever knew.